The snow came down in a hard, blinding sheet, not like the soft, quiet dustings that promised a peaceful winter, but like a fury sent to scour the world clean. It clung to the brim of Eli Warren's hat and melted on the warm leather of his collar, the cold seeping into him bone deep. His horse, a stout gray gelding named Boulder, plodded onward with the steady, uncomplaining gait of an animal that knew its job was simply to endure. Dust Creek was not so much a town as a raw wound on the face of the plains, a place where the wind never seemed to stop and hope came to die. A single muddy street, already half buried in white, was lined with a handful of false-fronted buildings, a saloon whose swinging doors groaned a constant protest, a general store with boarded-up windows, and the livery, which was Eli's destination. He had ridden 3 days through this unforgiving weather on the rumor that a black stallion with a white star, his stolen horse, Midnight, had been seen in the keeping of the liveryman here. A man did not take another man's horse. It was a simple rule, one that Eli intended to enforce. He swung down from Boulder, his legs stiff from the cold, and gave the gelding a firm pat on the neck. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood smoke and the metallic tang of the coming ice. As he looped the reins around the hitching post, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a sharp cry, followed by a man's low, angry voice. Eli looked toward the end of the street, where a large canvas tent had been pitched near the frozen banks of the creek that gave the town its miserable name. A sign, whipped by the wind, proclaimed it a place of revival, of salvation for the weary soul, under the guidance of a Reverend Thaddeus Kane. Just then, the tent flap was thrown open and a young woman stumbled out, her hair a wild tangle of dark brown, her dress torn at the shoulder. She took 2 desperate steps into the snow before a man's arm shot out and grabbed her. He was a tall, gaunt figure in a black coat, the Reverend himself, his face a mask of pious fury. "The devil has a hold on you, child," the preacher's voice rasped, loud enough to carry over the storm. "But I will beat him out." He dragged her back toward the tent. She struggled, a small, frantic thing against his iron grip, but it was no use. She cast one terrified look over her shoulder, her eyes wide and dark in a pale face, before the canvas flap fell shut, swallowing them both. The commotion was over in a matter of seconds. No one else seemed to have noticed, or if they had, they gave no sign. In a place like Dust Creek, minding one's own business was a currency more valuable than gold. Eli was a man who had made a long and lonely career of minding his own business. Attachments were anchors, and he was a man built to drift. Still, something about the girl's eyes, the sheer animal terror in them, snagged on a rough edge inside him. It felt wrong. It felt familiar. He shook the thought away, turning his attention back to the livery. He had his own troubles. He had come for a horse. Nothing more. The liveryman was a weasel of a man who swore up and down he had seen no black stallion, and Eli, though he did not believe him, knew he would get no further. He bought a measure of oats for Boulder and a bed of straw for himself in the hayloft, the scent of horse and hay a small comfort against the encroaching night. But as he lay in the dark, listening to the wind claw at the roof, the image of the girl's face returned to him. He had seen that look before, on another face, in another town, a lifetime ago, a face he had failed to save. The guilt was a cold, hard knot in his gut that never seemed to dissolve. Sleep would not come. Duty was a ghost that haunted him. The memory of his family's homestead, burned to the ground, the scent of smoke and death forever in his nostrils. He had been too young, too slow. And then later, the girl in Abilene, cornered by men whose smiles held no warmth. He had tried to intervene, and for his trouble, had ended up with a bullet in his side and the knowledge that she had not been saved. He had learned his lesson then. You cannot save everyone. Sometimes, you cannot save anyone. You can only save yourself by riding on But the wind howled like a woman screaming, and Eli Warren, for the first time in a long time, could not convince himself to ride on. The town was dark, lost in the swirling chaos of the storm. When he slipped out of the livery, he moved like a shadow, his boots making no sound in the deep snow. The preacher's tent was a faint, wavering shape against the oppressive blackness of the night, a single lantern within casting a sickly yellow glow. Eli drew his revolver, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hand, and slit the back of the canvas with his knife. He slipped inside. The air was close, smelling of lamp oil and unwashed bodies. The Reverend Thaddeus Kane was asleep on a cot, snoring softly, a Bible resting on his chest like a shield. On the other side of the tent, on a pile of dirty blankets, lay the girl. She was gagged with a strip of cloth, her hands and feet bound with rope. Her cheek was bruised, a dark purple stain against the pale skin, and a fresh cut bled sluggishly at her temple. Her eyes were open, staring at the canvas ceiling with a look of such hollow despair that it made Eli's breath catch in his throat. When she saw him, a flicker of fear crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by that same empty resignation. It was the look of a creature that had forgotten how to hope. Eli moved without a sound. He did not wake the preacher. He brought the barrel of his pistol down in a single, precise motion against the man's temple. There was a dull thud, and the snoring stopped. The Reverend went limp, his body slumping deeper into the cot. Eli did not check to see if he was dead or merely unconscious. He did not care. He knelt beside the girl and used his knife to saw through the ropes at her wrists and ankles. They were tied so tightly they had rubbed the skin raw. When he reached for the gag, she flinched, her whole body tensing as if expecting a blow. He paused, his hand hovering in the air. He kept his movements slow, deliberate. He gently worked the knot loose and pulled the cloth from her mouth. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He said nothing. There were no words for a moment like this. He simply scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her out into the storm. Boulder was where he had left him, a patient gray ghost in the blizzard. Eli swung the girl up onto the saddle and mounted behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to hold her steady. She was stiff and cold in his arms, a frozen doll. He pulled a spare blanket from his saddle roll and draped it over her, then urged Boulder forward, away from Dust Creek, away from the dead-end street and the preacher's tent, and into the vast, white wilderness of the mountains. For 2 days, she did not speak. She rode with him, ate the jerky and hardtack he offered, and drank from his canteen, but never uttered a sound. Her silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. Eli began to wonder if she could speak at all, if the preacher had broken something inside her beyond repair. He did not ask her name, nor did he offer his. They were two strangers, bound by a moment of violence, moving through a landscape as harsh and unforgiving as their own lives. The mountains were his sanctuary, a place where the world of men and their cruelties could not easily reach. His cabin was a small, sturdy structure he had built himself, nestled in a high valley, sheltered by ancient pines. It was not much, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and 2 cots. But it was solid. It was safe. When they arrived, the snow was falling so thick he could barely see the front door. He helped her down from the horse, his hands on her waist, and she felt fragile enough to break. He led her inside, into the cold, still air of the cabin, while he sought a boulder in the lean-to. She stood in the center of the room, unmoving, her arms wrapped around herself, the snow melting from her blanket and pooling at her feet. He built a fire, the crackle of the kindling a welcome sound in the oppressive quiet. The flames caught, grew, and began to push the chill from the room, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He put a pot of coffee on to boil and fried strips of salted pork in a skillet. The smell of food filled the small space. He set a plate on the table for her, but she made no move to eat. She just stood by the hearth, watching the fire, her face as blank as the snow-covered plains. That night, she slept on the cot furthest from the door, curled into a tight ball beneath 3 heavy wool blankets. Eli took the floor by the fireplace, his saddle for a pillow, his gun belt within easy reach. He was not a man given to comfort. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside and the soft, almost inaudible sound of her breathing. They were trapped together in this small space, 2 wounded animals taking shelter from the storm, both inside and out. The second day passed much like the first. Silence. He chopped wood, hauled in buckets of snow to melt for water, and checked his trap lines, finding a rabbit in one, which he skinned and stewed for their supper. She stayed inside, never straying far from the fire. He caught her watching him sometimes, her dark eyes filled with a wary, unreadable expression. If he met her gaze, she would look away immediately, retreating back behind her wall. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat at the table eating the rabbit stew, she finally spoke. Her voice was a surprise, soft and raspy from disuse, but clear. "Why did you help me?" Eli did not look up from his bowl. He took his time chewing a piece of meat, swallowing before he answered. He had known the question was coming. He had been asking it of himself. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "Because someone should have," he said. It was the truest answer he had. It was not for her, not really. It was for the ghosts he carried, for the debts he could never repay. She seemed to understand something in his tone, because she did not ask anything else. They finished their meal in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. A question had been asked, and an answer given. A single thread now connected them across the quiet room. In the days that followed, a routine settled over them as steady and monotonous as the falling snow. They existed in the small world of the cabin, their lives dictated by the simple, pressing needs of survival. He would hunt and chop wood. She began, hesitantly at first. To help with the chores inside, she swept the floor with a broom made of birch branches, washed their 2 plates and mugs, and mended a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread from his supply kit. Her stitches were small and neat, her movements deft and practiced. He learned things about her in the quiet. He learned that she was afraid of sudden noises, that she slept poorly, often crying out in her sleep, small, muffled sounds of distress. He learned that she liked the way the firelight looked on the frost-covered window panes. He never pressed her for information, never asked about the preacher or the bruises that were slowly fading from her skin. He gave her silence, and in return, she seemed to find a measure of peace in it. One evening, she was stirring a pot of beans over the fire, the sleeve of her worn dress falling back from her arm. In the flickering light, Eli saw them, a series of thin, white lines crisscrossing the delicate skin of her wrist. Old scars, long healed, but unmistakable in their origin. They were not the marks of an accident. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had seen scars like that before. Too, she must have felt his gaze, because she quickly pulled the sleeve down, her movement stiff and self-conscious. But he said nothing, turning his attention back to cleaning his rifle, his knuckles white as he gripped the oilcloth. To speak of it would be to name it, and to name it would be to give it power. His silence was the only kindness he knew how to offer. A week after they arrived, as he was stacking firewood beside the door, she approached him. The wind had died down for a spell, and the world outside was hushed, blanketed in a deep and profound quiet. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She was looking at the woodpile, not at him. "For everything." Eli finished setting a heavy log in place before he straightened up and turned to face her. Her dark hair was clean now, and she had mended the tear in her dress. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was banked, like embers glowing beneath a layer of ash. She was still fragile, but she was no longer broken. "I did not do it for thanks," he said, his voice low and rough. He did not mean for it to sound harsh, but the words came out that way all the same. It was the truth. He had not acted out of charity or kindness. He had acted out of a raw, selfish need to quiet the ghosts that whispered his failures to him in the dark. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not hurt, but understanding. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and went back inside the cabin. Eli stood there for a long moment, the cold air biting at his face, watching the door she had closed behind her. Something had passed between them in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of the darkness they both carried. It was not friendship, and it was certainly not love. It was something far more raw and fundamental, recognition, and in the vast, lonely wilderness of the mountains, that was more than enough. It was everything. The first sign of spring was not a flower, but a sound. The steady drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the cabin's eaves. It was a gentle, persistent rhythm that spoke of a world waking from a long and frozen sleep. The deep drifts that had buried the valley began to shrink, pulling back from the foundations of the cabin to reveal patches of dark, damp earth. The creek, which had been a silent ribbon of ice, began to murmur and then to roar, its voice growing stronger with each passing day. With the breaking of the weather came a change in Clara. The walls of the cabin, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. She began to venture outside, at first just for a few moments, standing on the small porch and breathing in the scent of pine and thawing soil. Then her explorations grew bolder. She walked the perimeter of the small clearing, her boots sinking into the soft, slushy snow. Soon, she was climbing the gentle slope behind the cabin, her steps hesitant but determined, until she could stand among the tall pines and look down upon the small curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Eli watched her, but never followed. He gave her the space she seemed to crave, this quiet communion with the waking land. He saw the strength returning to her legs, the color rising in her cheeks. The hollowed-out look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a cautious curiosity. She was like a wild thing, long trapped, rediscovering the feel of the sun on her face. Her silence was changing, too. It was no longer the heavy, brittle silence of trauma, but a more comfortable quiet, the kind shared by two people who have no need for unnecessary words. One evening, as a warm Chinook wind rattled the window pane, she began to speak of her past. The fire crackled in the hearth, a comforting counterpoint to the wind's mournful song. She was mending one of his shirts, her head bent over her work, the needle moving in and out of the rough fabric with a steady, practiced rhythm. "I do not remember my parents," she said, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. "They died of a fever when I was very small. The church took me in. I was raised in the St. Jude's missionary orphanage for girls." Eli sat across from her, cleaning his revolver, the metallic clicks of the cylinder turning the only sound for a long moment. He did not look at her, but kept his eyes on his work, giving her the courtesy of his inattention. "It was not a cruel place," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "Just gray. We learned our letters and our prayers. We learned how to scrub floors until our knuckles were raw and how to be grateful for every mouthful of thin stew. We were taught that the world was a wicked place and that our only hope for salvation was to be meek and obedient." She paused, her needle still for a moment. "I was a good student. I learned to be very obedient." He could hear the faint tremor in her voice, the echo of a lesson learned too well. He waited. "When I was 16, Reverend Kane came to the orphanage. He was looking for a girl to assist his wife, he said, to help with his traveling ministry. The matron said he was a man of God, a pillar of the faith. She said it was a great opportunity, a chance to do the Lord's work. She chose me." She finally looked up from her sewing, her dark eyes meeting his across the flickering light. He did not have a wife. The simple, stark statement hung in the air between them, heavy with all the things she did not say. Eli stopped his work, his hands resting on the cool metal of the gun. He saw the whole wretched story in her eyes, the betrayal, the slow dawning of a terrible truth, the years of quiet fear that followed. He felt a familiar, useless anger rise in him, hot and bitter in his throat. He said nothing. He did not offer words of comfort or pity. She did not need his pity. She had survived. That was more than most could say. He simply met her gaze and held it, a silent acknowledgement of her pain, a testament to her strength. After a long moment, she looked back down at her sewing, and the needle began to move once more. She did not speak of it again, but a door had been opened. A piece of her story now belonged to him, a fragile trust placed in his hands. As the days lengthened, they fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the needs of the coming spring. The harsh intimacy of their forced winter confinement gave way to the shared labor of the season. They worked side by side, mending the section of fence that had been crushed by a heavy snowfall. He would dig the post holes in the soft earth, his muscles straining, and she would follow behind him, tamping the dirt around the new posts until they stood straight and true. She was surprisingly strong, her movements efficient and uncomplaining. In the mornings, they would share a pot of coffee on the porch, watching the sun burn the mist out of the valley. They rarely spoke during these times, but the silence was companionable. He would whittle a piece of wood into a rough shape, and she would watch the birds returning to the trees, a small, secret smile sometimes touching her lips. He found himself looking for that smile, a rare and precious thing. Clara, in turn, began to study him. She would catch him staring off into the distance, his eyes narrowed, his face a mask of old grief. She saw the way he favored his left side, the way his hand would sometimes drift to a place just above his hip, where she suspected a deep scar lay hidden beneath his shirt. She saw him watching her, too, his gaze steady and serious. It was not the way other men had looked at her. There was no hunger in his eyes, no pity. Nothing that made her feel small or tainted. It was a look of quiet assessment, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle he did not fully understand. It made her feel seen, not as a broken thing, but as a person. It was a feeling so new. It was almost frightening. One afternoon, while clearing loose rocks from what he planned to be a small garden patch, her foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. She went down hard, her knee striking the sharp edge of a stone. A cry of pain escaped her lips before she could stifle it. Eli was at her side in an instant. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "I am fine," she said, trying to push herself up, but a fresh wave of pain made her gasp. He knelt beside her. "Let me see." His command was gentle but firm. She hesitated for a second, then straightened her leg. The fabric of her dress was torn, and blood was welling from a deep, jagged scrape on her knee. Without another word, he scooped her up into his arms and carried her back to the cabin. He was all business, his movements efficient and impersonal, but she was acutely aware of the strength in his arms, the solid warmth of his chest against her back. He set her down carefully on her cot and went to fetch a basin of water and his medical supplies. He knelt before her and gently pushed the torn fabric of her dress up to her thigh. His touch was light, his fingers rough but surprisingly careful. He cleaned the wound with a cloth dipped in carbolic acid, and she hissed as it stung. "Sorry," he muttered, not looking at her face. "It will keep the poison out." He worked with a quiet concentration, his brow furrowed. His hands were steady as he applied a clean bandage, his movements economical and precise. When he was done, his hand lingered for a fraction of a second on her calf, a moment of stillness that sent a strange, fluttering heat through her. Her breath caught in her throat. He must have felt her reaction, because he immediately pulled his hand away and stood up, turning his back to her. "Rest it for a day," he said. His voice clipped. He walked over to the fireplace and began to stir the embers with the poker, his shoulders stiff. The moment was over. But something had shifted between them. A line had been crossed, a silent awareness now humming in the space that separated them. A few nights later, A late spring storm rolled in, trapping them inside with the sound of rain drumming on the roof and wind moaning in the chimney. Eli brought out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving and poured 2 fingers' worth into their tin mugs. "This will keep the damp out," he said, handing one to her. She took it, the raw, smoky smell of the liquor stinging her nose. She had never had whiskey before. She took a small sip and coughed, the fiery liquid burning a path down her throat. Eli watched her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was the first time she had ever seen him almost smile. They drank in silence for a while, the whiskey slowly spreading a pleasant warmth through her limbs. The storm and the liquor seemed to loosen something in her, a question that had been sitting on her tongue for weeks. "Did you ever love anyone, Eli?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. He stared into the fire, his face unreadable in the flickering light. He took a slow drink from his mug before he answered. "Once," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Her name was Sarah." He fell silent, and Clara thought that was all he would say. But then he spoke again, his voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. "We were going to be married, had a piece of land picked out, by a creek. We were in town, buying supplies. Some men, they were drunk. They decided they wanted her more than I did." He stopped, his knuckles white where he gripped his mug. "I was not fast enough. I was never fast enough." Clara's heart ached for him, for the girl named Sarah, for the raw pain that was still so evident in his voice after what must have been years. She understood now the source of the ghosts in his eyes. They had this in common, this haunting. His past was a mirror to her own, a different kind of violence, a different kind of loss. But the scars were the same. She found her own voice then, a confession rising to meet his. "I do not know how to be touched," she whispered, the words tasting of shame, not without flinching. "I do not think I ever will." Eli turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes clear and steady. The pity she had always dreaded was not there. In its place was a deep, quiet understanding. "Then I will not touch you," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "Not until you ask." The promise settled between them, a profound and startling gift. He was giving her back something she thought had been stolen from her forever: control. In that moment, sitting in the storm-lashed cabin, sharing a bottle of cheap whiskey, she felt safer with this quiet, dangerous man than she had ever felt in her life. But as spring bloomed in earnest, a new tension began to grow. The world outside was bursting with life. Wildflowers carpeted the valley floor in a riot of blue and yellow, and the aspens put forth new, trembling green leaves. Nature was awakening, and with it, something was awakening between them, a fragile, unspoken tenderness. Yet, even as the world came alive, Eli began to prepare for his departure. He spent his afternoons in the sun, oiling his saddle until the leather gleamed. He cleaned and re-cleaned his guns, checking their mechanisms with a practiced eye. He spoke of riding south, of finding work on a cattle drive, of moving on. Every word was a small stone dropped into the quiet pool of their life, sending ripples of anxiety through Clara. He was a drifter, and drifters never stayed. She had known that from the beginning, but knowing it did not make the thought of his leaving any less painful. One night, the bad dreams returned. She was back in the preacher's tent, the smell of lamp oil and sweat filling her nostrils, his weight pressing down on her, his voice whispering pious filth in her ear. She woke with a strangled cry, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of a boot scraping on the floor brought her back to the present. Eli was standing over her cot, a dark silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. "Clara?" he asked, his voice low and laced with sleep. A sob broke from her throat, a raw, ragged sound she could not hold back. She curled into a ball, shaking uncontrollably, the dream still clinging to her like a shroud. She felt the cot dip as he sat on the edge of it. He hesitated for a long moment, and she knew he was remembering his promise. But then he reached out and gently, tentatively, pulled her into his arms. He did not say a word. He just held her, one hand stroking her hair, the other resting firmly on her back. He held her as she cried, her tears soaking the front of his shirt. He held her until the shaking subsided and her breathing evened out. He held her until the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the window. It was just a comfort. Just that. But in the quiet darkness of the cabin, it felt like an anchor in a raging sea. It felt like everything. The need for supplies could no longer be ignored. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee tin held only a few precious beans, and the salt was a fine dust at the bottom of its box. The snow had receded to the high peaks, and the trail down to Dust Creek, though thick with mud, was passable. The journey that had been a desperate flight through a blizzard was now a slow, deliberate ride under a pale blue sky. Clara was quiet on the ride down, her hands clasped tightly around the saddle horn. She wore a simple brown dress she had mended herself, and her hair was tied back with a piece of twine. To Eli, she looked like a different person from the bruised, terrified girl he had carried out of the preacher's tent. She sat taller in the saddle of the spare horse he had bought from a traveling trapper, her shoulders straight, but he could see the tension in the set of her jaw. This was her first return to the world of men, and the world of men had never been kind to her. As they rode into the single muddy street of Dust Creek, Eli felt her flinch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The town was just as he remembered it, a collection of tired buildings hunched against the vastness of the plains. But now, in the clear light of day, it seemed smaller, meaner, and it had eyes. From the moment they dismounted in front of the general store, they were being watched. A woman sweeping her porch stopped, her broom still, her gaze sharp and disapproving. Two men lounging outside the saloon fell silent, their eyes following Clara as she walked beside Eli. Whispers followed them like flies, low and venomous. Clara's head bowed, her focus fixed on the wooden planks of the boardwalk beneath her feet. She seemed to shrink into herself, trying to become invisible. Eli did not try to be invisible. He grew larger, his presence a physical shield around her. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. He did not look for trouble, but he met every stare with a glare of his own, cold and flat and promising a world of hurt. The whispers died down when his gaze passed over them. The men at the saloon found something interesting to look at in the bottom of their beer mugs. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and dust. A pot-bellied man named Henderson stood behind the counter. His wife, a thin woman with a face like sour milk, beside him, Mrs. Henderson's eyes raked over Clara from head to toe, a look of smug piety on her face. Eli ignored her, rattling off his list in a low, even voice. 50 pounds of flour, 10 of sugar, 5 of coffee, salt, beans, a side of bacon. As Henderson began to measure out the goods, his wife leaned forward and spoke to a neighbor who was inspecting a bolt of calico. Her voice was a stage whisper, designed to carry. "Some creatures have no shame," she said, her eyes fixed on Clara. "Living up in the mountains with a man, and her no better than she should be. Damaged goods, if you ask me." The other woman tittered. Henderson's husband chuckled, a low, greasy sound. Clara froze, her face draining of all color. She looked as if she had been struck. Eli saw the light in her eyes extinguish, the cautious hope of the past week snuffed out in an instant. Something inside Eli, a tightly coiled spring of rage he kept buried deep, finally snapped. He moved so fast he was a blur. He did not touch the woman, but he was across the small space in 2 strides. His hand clamped down on the counter in front of her husband, the wood groaning under the pressure. He leaned in close, his face inches from the man's, his voice a low, deadly rumble. "Laugh again," Eli said, the words perfectly calm, perfectly lethal. I dare you." Henderson's chuckle died in his throat. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty white. He stared into Eli's eyes and saw something there that terrified him. A complete and utter absence of fear. The man before him was a man who had nothing left to lose and would not hesitate to burn the whole world down. Henderson swallowed hard, a slick of sweat beading on his upper lip. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement. Eli held his gaze for another long second, then straightened up and turned away as if nothing had happened. He walked back to Clara's side, his movements calm and unhurried. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked her, his voice as gentle as it had been menacing a moment before. She shook her head, unable to speak. The store was utterly silent. "Mrs." Henderson looked as if she had swallowed a wasp. Eli paid for their supplies, his movements economical, and carried the heavy sacks outside. He loaded them onto the pack horse, then helped Clara mount her own. They rode out of Dust Creek without a backward glance, leaving a thick, ringing silence in their wake. The ride back to the cabin was heavy with unspoken words. The sun was warm on their backs. The air was sweet with the scent of pine, but a chill had settled between them. Eli could feel her beside him, radiating a misery that was a physical thing. He had tried to protect her, but all he had done was make a spectacle of them, confirming in the town's eyes that she was his, a possession to be fought over. When they were halfway up the mountain trail, she finally spoke. "Do not do that again," she said, her voice tight. Eli kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Do what?" "Fight for me like that. Threaten people." She turned to look at him, her face earnest and troubled. "It will not help. People will always talk. They will say what they want to say, and nothing you do will stop them." She took a breath. "You will be the one who is ruined. They will call you a brawler, a troublemaker. They will run you out of town, or worse. For me," the last two words were heavy with a weight he could not bear. He had never considered his own reputation. It was a thing he had shed years ago, along with his name and his past. But she was thinking of him, of the consequences he might face for her sake. The realization struck him with an unexpected force. "My reputation is not worth much," he said gruffly. "It is worth more than mine," she countered softly. "Please, Eli, do not let them hurt you because of me." He had no answer for that. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Back at the cabin, the familiar quiet felt different, strained. The safety of their isolation had been breached. The ugliness of the world had followed them home. As they unpacked the supplies, arranging them on the shelves, Clara moved with a leaden slowness, her earlier animation gone. The joy he had seen blooming in her had withered. That evening, after a supper eaten in near silence, she stood by the window, looking out at the darkening valley. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice so quiet he barely heard her. "Regret what?" he asked, though he knew. She turned to face him, her expression shadowed and uncertain. "Taking me in, bringing me here. If you had left me in that town, you would be free. You could ride wherever you pleased, and no one's trouble would be your own." He stood up from the table and walked over to where she stood. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the genuine fear in her eyes, the fear that she was a burden he was growing tired of carrying. He had to extinguish that fear once and for all. "Clara," he said, his voice low and firm, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I have regretted many things in my life. I have made more mistakes than I can count, but bringing you here..." He shook his head, a small, definite motion. Not for a second. The relief that washed over her face was like the sun breaking through clouds. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she gave him a watery, trembling smile. The simple, unequivocal truth of his words had mended something the town's cruelty had broken. He had not just rescued her body. He was, in these small, quiet moments, rescuing her soul. In the days that followed, the change in her was remarkable. It was as if his reassurance had given her permission to be happy. The tentative smiles he had occasionally seen now came more frequently, lighting up her whole face. She began to hum as she cooked, old, half-forgotten melodies from her childhood at the orphanage. The tunes were often sad, but she hummed them with a lightness that transformed them into something else entirely. Eli found himself watching her, mesmerized. He watched the way her hands moved as she kneaded dough for bread, the way she tilted her head when she listened to the birdsong outside the open door, the way her eyes shone when she discovered a patch of wild strawberries growing by the creek. He had brought her here to save her from a tangible danger, but he was discovering that her quiet, resilient joy was, in turn, saving him from the dead. Gray emptiness that had been his life for so long. He was drawn to it, to her, like a man dying of thirst is drawn to water. The thought was a dangerous one, and he tried to push it away, but it lingered, stubborn and persistent. A week later, he told her he needed to ride to town again for nails and a new axe head. She offered to come with him, but he shook his head. "It is better if I go alone," he said. He did not want to subject her to the town's judgment again. She accepted his decision with a nod, but he saw a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. He was back by dusk, along with the hardware. He carried a small, flat parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He found her on the porch, watching the last rays of sun paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. "I brought you something," he said, his voice feeling unnaturally loud in the quiet evening air. He held out the package. She looked from the parcel to his face, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. She took it from him, her fingers brushing against his. She carefully untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a book. It was not new. The dark blue cover was faded and worn at the edges, the spine soft with use. The title was stamped in gold leaf that had mostly rubbed away, but she could still make out the words, "Selected Poems of Elizabeth Barrett Browning." She stared at it, her fingers tracing the worn cover as if it were a holy relic. She lifted her eyes to his, and they were shining with unshed tears. "Why?" she whispered. He shrugged, feeling awkward and exposed under her emotional gaze. "I saw it in the store. I thought you might like it." He did not tell her that he had traded his good hunting knife for it. He did not tell her that the moment he saw it, he had thought of her, of the quiet intelligence in her eyes, of the hunger for something beautiful in a world that had only shown her ugliness. "No one has ever," she started, her voice thick. "No one has ever given me a gift before, not one that did not come with a price." She stood up and, without thinking, placed a hand on his forearm to steady herself. "Thank you, Eli." Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt through him, a warmth that spread from that single point of contact up his arm and into his chest. He looked down at her small hand on his sleeve, then back up to her face. Their eyes met and held. It was an accident, this touch, born of a moment of overwhelming emotion. But neither of them pulled away. The air crackled between them, thick with all the words they had never said, all the feelings they had kept locked away. After a long, breathless moment, she slowly drew her hand back, but the connection remained, a phantom warmth on his skin. That night, the tension in the cabin was a living thing. It was in the way he watched her as she read her new book by the firelight, her lips moving silently with the words. It was in the way she was aware of his every movement, the scrape of his boot on the hearth, the soft sound of his breathing. When it was time to sleep, she did not go to her cot immediately. She set the book aside, and with a quiet deliberation that made his heart beat faster, she began her nightly ritual. She poured water from the kettle into the wash basin, but this time, she did not turn her back to him for privacy. She faced the fire, and him. As she unbuttoned the front of her dress, she let it slide from her shoulders and pool at her feet, leaving her in her thin cotton shift. She moved with a slow, trembling grace, not in shame, but in a quiet, powerful declaration. She dipped a cloth in the warm water and began to wash her face and arms, her movements unhurried. The firelight played over the graceful curve of her neck, the sharp line of her collarbone. Eli sat perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists on his knees, his throat tight. He was holding his breath. When she was finished, she did not put her dress back on. She stood before the fire in her shift, a slender silhouette against the flames, and turned her head to look at him. "Do you still plan on riding away when the thaw comes?" she asked, her voice a soft, steady whisper in the crackling silence. The question he had been both dreading and longing for. The drifter in him, the man who had survived by never putting down roots, screamed at him to say yes, to say it and mean it, to get on his horse tomorrow and ride until her face was just another ghost in his memory. He stared into the flames, watching them dance and writhe, a reflection of the war inside him. He thought of the empty plains, the lonely campfires, the years of looking over his shoulder, and then he thought of her smile, of the sound of her humming, of the feel of her hand on his arm. He finally looked at her, at this brave, broken, beautiful woman who had somehow found her way into the barricaded fortress of his heart. "Yes," he said, the word tasting like a lie, like a betrayal. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the slight fall of her shoulders. Then he added, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name, "But maybe not right away." Her answering smile was slow, shaky, but radiant. It was enough. They did not touch. He stayed on his side of the hearth, and she went to her cot. The promise he had made her still stood between them, a barrier of his own making. But the space in the cabin felt different tonight. It no longer felt like a chasm. He lay down on his bedroll, and she lay on her cot. And in the warm, fire-lit darkness, they listened to the sound of each other's breathing, closer than they had ever been before. The fragile peace they had built was shattered by a trip to town. Eli rode in alone this time, leaving Clara with the poetry book and a week's worth of chores to keep her occupied. He told himself it was to spare her the stares and whispers, but a deeper, more honest part of him knew he was also trying to preserve the sanctuary of the cabin, to keep the outside world from tainting it again. Dust Creek was unchanged, but the atmosphere felt different. There was a new horse tied to the rail outside the saloon, a fine-boned chestnut with a saddle that spoke of money and long, hard miles. And standing on the saloon porch was its owner, a man Eli had never seen before. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark, practical clothing that was well kept but not flashy. A Colt Peacemaker was holstered low on his hip, the leather worn smooth in all the right places. But it was his eyes that held Eli's attention. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they missed nothing. They swept over the street, over every person who walked by, with a cold, professional assessment. This was not a drifter or a ranch hand. This was a man who hunted other men for a living. Eli went about his business at the general store, his senses on high alert. He bought the nails and the axe head, and while Henderson weighed them out, Eli kept his back to the wall, his gaze on the street outside. He saw the stranger walk into the livery, and a few minutes later, walk out again. Shaking his head, the man was asking questions. Eli paid Henderson, his mind racing. There was only one reason a man like that would come to a dead-end place like Dust Creek. He was looking for someone. And there was only one person connected to this town who would likely have a price on his head. Not for being a true criminal, but for being a witness, or a loose end, a girl stolen from a preacher. His blood ran cold. He had been a fool. In his haste to get Clara away, in his own simmering rage, he had been careless. He had struck the Reverend Cain and left him, assuming the man was either dead or would be too ashamed to pursue the matter. He had not considered the possibility that Cain was more than just a common brute, that he might have connections, or that what he was doing to Clara was part of a larger, more sinister enterprise. He had underestimated his enemy. It was a mistake he had sworn he would never make again. He rode back to the cabin with a knot of ice in his stomach. The sun was warm on his shoulders, but he felt a winter chill deep in his bones. He had given her a few weeks of peace, a small island of quiet in the turbulent sea of her life. But the tide was coming in, and he had led the danger right to her door. He found her by the creek, washing their clothes against a smooth, flat rock. She was humming, the sound a soft counterpoint to the rush of the water. She looked up when she heard his horse, and her face broke into a genuine, unguarded smile. The sight of it was like a knife to his gut. He was about to destroy that smile, perhaps forever. He waited until after supper. The new axe head was fitted, the nails were put away, and the familiar, comfortable routine of the evening settled around them. The fire cast a warm glow on the log walls, and Clara was reading her book, her brow furrowed in concentration. The domestic peace of the scene was a bitter irony. "Clara," he said, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. She looked up, her finger marking her place on the page. "Yes?" He took a breath. There was no easy way to say it. "I saw a man in town today, a bounty hunter." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of confusion in them. A bounty hunter? What would a man like that be doing in Dust Creek? "He was asking questions," Eli said, his voice flat, "about a traveling preacher who passed through in the winter. He was asking if anyone had seen where the preacher went, or the girl who was with him." The book slid from her lap and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The color drained from her face, leaving it as pale as bleached bone. The old fear was back in her eyes, stark and terrible. "The preacher," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "But you—" "I hit him," Eli finished for her. "I did not kill him. I should have, but I did not. I just wanted to get you out of there." She stared at him, her mind clearly working, putting the pieces together. The bounty hunter, the preacher, alive, and now, the inevitable conclusion. "He sent him," she said. It was not a question. "He sent that man to find me." "I do not know if Cain sent him," Eli said, choosing his words carefully. "The man could be working for the law, if Cain reported you as a runaway. Or he could be working for someone else, but either way, it means trouble is coming." He met her gaze, his own eyes hard with a self-loathing he could not hide. "It means the preacher is alive, and he knows I am the one who took you." She was silent for a long time, her hands twisting in her lap. The fire crackled, filling the heavy silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was not fearful, but filled with a quiet, wounded accusation. "Why did you not tell me he was still alive?" The question hit him harder than a physical blow. It was a question of trust, and he knew, in that moment, that he had broken it. He had made a decision for her, treated her like a child who needed to be protected from a frightening truth. He had no defense, only the truth. "Because I wanted to give you peace for a little while," he said, his voice low and raw. "I saw what he did to you. I saw the look in your eyes. I wanted you to have a place where you could feel safe, even if it was just for a short time. I wanted you to be able to sleep without dreaming of him, to walk outside without looking over your shoulder. Telling you he was alive, it would have taken that away from you. I was wrong. I should have told you from the start, but that is why I did not." He expected anger, or more fear. He did not expect the tears that welled in her eyes, shining in the firelight. She did not sob or make a sound. The tears simply overflowed and traced silent paths down her pale cheeks. She was not crying for the preacher or for the bounty hunter. She was crying for the peace she had been given, and for the man who had tried, in his own rough, clumsy way, to give it to her. That night, the space between them in the cabin was no longer a chasm of unspoken tension, but a fragile bridge of shared vulnerability. The threat was no longer a distant memory. It was a living thing, camped just a few miles down the mountain, and its presence changed everything. The time for waiting, for hesitating, was over. Eli was banking the fire for the night when he felt a small, cool hand slide into his. He froze, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers. He turned his head slowly. Clara stood beside him, her face pale but resolute in the dim light. Her hand in his was trembling, but her grip was firm. She was asking, "I want it to be different," she whispered, her voice shaking but clear. "With you." He straightened up and faced her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down into her eyes and saw a universe of pain, but also a fierce, desperate hope. She was offering him the most precious, most damaged part of herself, and the weight of that trust was immense. "Are you sure?" he asked, his own voice hoarse. It was the most important question he had ever asked. He had to give her the choice, the one thing no one else ever had, for an answer. She raised his hand to her lips and pressed a soft, trembling kiss to his calloused knuckles. Then, holding his gaze, she reached up with her free hand to the buttons of her dress. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking so much she could barely work them. He did not move, did not help her. This had to be hers, and hers alone. She unfastened the first button, then the second. Slowly, deliberately. She opened her dress and let it fall from her shoulders, pooling in a dark circle at her feet. She stood before him in her thin white shift, a fragile silhouette against the dying fire. She was trembling from head to toe, not from cold, but from the sheer, terrifying bravery of her own actions. He reached out then, his hand shaking as much as hers, and cupped her face. Her skin was soft, damp with tears. He tilted her head up and lowered his own, and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, of hunger. It was a kiss of reverence. It was slow and gentle, and spoke of all the things he had no words for, of his respect for her courage, of his ache for her pain, of the fierce, protective tenderness she had awakened in him. He lifted her into his arms and carried her the few feet to his own bedroll, a place that smelled of leather and wood smoke and him. He laid her down gently and covered her with a blanket, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to stop him. But she did not. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous, and in them he saw not fear, but a profound and absolute trust. What happened between them in the warm darkness of the cabin was not a taking, but a giving. It was a quiet, tender exploration, a rewriting of a history that had only ever been written in violence. His every touch was a question, and her every response an answer. It was a slow, cathartic release, a sacred ceremony of healing in which two broken people, for a few precious hours, made each other whole. When it was over, she lay curled against his side, her head on his chest, and she began to cry. Not the silent tears of before, but deep, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. It was the sound of years of unshed grief, of pain held so tightly for so long that it had nearly turned to stone. Eli did not speak. He simply held her, his arms a safe harbor in the storm of her sorrow. He stroked her hair and whispered her name, over and over, a quiet litany in the dark. He held her as the past was washed away on a tide of tears, and he held her until she finally cried herself to sleep, her breathing soft and even against his skin. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Eli Warren did not feel like he was alone. The knock on the door came just after dawn. It was a sharp, peremptory sound that shattered the morning peace. Eli was instantly awake, every nerve on fire. Clara stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open, filled with a sleepy confusion that quickly turned to fear as the knock came again, louder this time. Eli was already moving, pulling on his trousers and grabbing his gun belt from the floor. He motioned for her to stay quiet, to get dressed away from the window. He moved to the door, his revolver in his hand, and stood to the side of it. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice low and steady. "Looking for a man named Warren," a calm, professional voice replied. "Name's Jedediah Kane. I'm looking for a runaway girl." Eli's jaw tightened. Kane, the bounty hunter. He glanced back at Clara. She was dressed, her face a pale mask of terror, the book of poetry clutched in her hands like a prayer book. Eli took a breath and opened the door, stepping out onto the porch to block the entrance. The bounty hunter stood a few feet away, his hand resting casually on his hip, near his gun. His washed-out blue eyes took in Eli's bare chest, the gun in his hand, and the closed door behind him, and a flicker of something, understanding, perhaps, passed over his face. "Warren," Kane said, his voice flat. "I have a warrant for a girl named Clara Mae Sims, a ward of the Reverend Thaddeus Kane. He says you abducted her." "The Reverend is a liar," Eli said, his voice equally flat. "The girl is not his ward, and she was not abducted. She was being held against her will. I removed her from a dangerous situation. That is all." Kane's gaze did not waver. "That is not what the warrant says. The warrant says she belongs with him. My job is to bring her back. I get paid $500 to do it. I do not care about the particulars." "Then you will have to find another way to make your money," Eli said. "She is not going with you." The two men stood there, sizing each other up in the cool morning air. The birds were singing in the pines, and the creek murmured in the distance, a peaceful soundtrack to a deadly confrontation. Kane was good. Eli could see it. He was fast and confident, but Eli had something Kane did not. He was not fighting for money. "This does not have to be difficult, Warren," Kane said, his voice taking on a slightly weary tone. "I do not want to have to kill you over this. Just give me the girl, and I will be on my way. You can go back to whatever it is you do." "No," Eli said. The word was final, an unbreakable wall. Kane sighed, a small puff of white in the cool air. "All right, have it your way." He looked past Eli, his eyes trying to pierce the shadows within the cabin. "But know this, Kane wants her back, badly. If I cannot bring her back, he will send others, men who are not as particular as I am about who gets hurt in the process." He gave Eli a long, hard look. "You cannot hide her forever." With that, he turned, walked to his horse, and mounted up. He rode away without a backward glance. Disappearing into the trees, he was gone, but the threat he represented lingered, a poison in the air. Eli stepped back inside and closed the door, his shoulders slumping slightly. He had won the confrontation, but he had lost the peace. He turned to find Clara standing right behind him, her eyes wide, no longer with fear, but with a terrible, clear-sighted understanding. "He is right," she said, her voice steady. "They will come back." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "If you stay, they will come for you, and if you leave, they will come for me." It was the simple, brutal truth of their situation. There was no escape. They were bound together by a danger that would hunt them both, together or apart. Eli looked at her, at the quiet strength that had replaced her fear, and he felt the last of his old life, the life of the drifter, fall away like a snake shedding its skin. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man with a future to protect, a future that stood before him, clutching a book of poems. He reached out and took the book from her hands, setting it on the table. He took her hands in his. "Then I will make sure they never find you," he said. It was not a boast. It was a vow. They left the cabin at dawn, a gray, mournful light filtering through the pines. There was no time for sentiment, no long goodbyes to the only home Clara had ever known. They packed only what was essential: a skillet, a sack of flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, and blankets. Eli took his rifle from the pegs above the door, and Clara wrapped her book of poems in an oilcloth, a small, precious piece of a life that was already turning into a memory. As Eli swung the heavy wooden door shut for the last time, the sound echoed in the quiet valley, a final, definitive end to their brief season of peace. They were burning the last bridge to the life they'd started to build, stepping off into the vast, unforgiving wilderness with nothing but each other. Their world shrank to the rhythm of survival. They moved through the high country, following game trails and the contours of the land, always climbing, always seeking the most inaccessible terrain. Eli, the protector, became her teacher. He taught her how to walk without leaving a clear trail, how to read the meaning of a broken twig or a disturbed patch of leaves. He taught her which plants were safe to eat and which springs held clean water. He taught her the profound, watchful silence of the hunted. And Clara, the student, proved to be far stronger than he had ever imagined. The timid, frightened girl from the preacher's tent was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet, formidable resilience. She never complained about the hard miles, the cold nights, or the gnawing emptiness in her belly when game was scarce. There was a core of iron in her that had been forged in the loveless fires of the orphanage and tempered by the cruelty of Reverend Cain. She had learned to endure, and that, in the wilderness, was the most valuable skill of all. She became resourceful. It was she who noticed the wild onions growing in a patch of damp earth, adding a welcome flavor to their bland diet of roasted squirrel. It was she who devised a way to mend his torn jacket using a pine needle and a thread pulled from her own hem. She was brave, standing her ground without a sound when a large black bear lumbered across their path not 50 yards away, her hand resting on the hilt of the skinning knife Eli had given her, and she was fiercely, profoundly loyal. She was his shadow, his second pair of eyes, his silent partner in this desperate flight. The unspoken fears and desires that had charged the air in the cabin were burned away by the harsh, clarifying reality of their situation, leaving behind a bedrock of absolute, unshakable trust. They found signs of their pursuers a week into their journey. Eli spotted them from a high ridge, 2 riders, moving slowly, methodically, their heads down as they studied the ground. They were too far away to make out their faces, but he did not need to. He knew they were not random travelers. They moved with the patient, relentless purpose of wolves on a scent. "Cain's men," he said, his voice a low growl. He passed his field glass to Clara. She raised it to her eye, her hand steady. "The preacher is not with them," she observed. "He would not dirty his own hands," Eli said bitterly. "He hires men to do his dirty work." They watched as the 2 riders made camp for the night in a small canyon below. One man was large and thick-set, moving with a brutish impatience. The other was smaller, wiry, and it was he who seemed to be in charge, directing the other in setting up the camp with a quiet, efficient authority. He was the tracker. "We need to move faster," Eli said, lowering the glass, "and get to rougher country. A place where horses cannot easily follow." They traveled for 2 more days, pushing themselves to the point of exhaustion, their path taking them higher into the jagged, rocky spine of the mountains. They spoke little, the words swallowed by the vast silence of the high peaks. The unspoken truth hung between them. They were not losing their pursuers. The tracker was good, and they were running out of places to hide. The skirmish happened in the late afternoon, in a narrow pass littered with boulders the size of small cabins. They had stopped to rest, to catch their breath in the thin mountain air. Eli was scouting the trail ahead, moving cautiously from one rock to another. When the first shot rang out, the bullet ricocheted off a granite boulder inches from his head, showering him with stone chips that stung his cheek. He reacted on pure instinct, diving behind the rock as a second shot echoed through the pass. He risked a quick look around the edge of the boulder and saw them, the 2 men, not more than 100 yards down the trail, taking cover behind a rockfall. The big man was reloading his rifle, while the wiry tracker was drawing a bead with his own. "Clara, stay down!" Eli yelled, his voice raw. He raised his own rifle, aimed, and fired, the shot kicking up dirt near the tracker's position. It was enough to make the man duck back behind his cover. This was not a fight he could win. He was outgunned, 2-1, and pinned down. Their only chance was to retreat, to fall back and find another path. He fired 2 more shots to keep their heads down, then turned. "We have to go, back the way we came." He scrambled back towards where he had left Clara, keeping low. He heard a whizzing sound past his ear, and then a sledgehammer blow struck him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the rock wall. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his body. He grunted, the air driven from his lungs, and slid down the face of the rock, his rifle clattering to the ground. Another bullet grazed his temple, and the world dissolved into a dizzying, gray fog. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Clara scream his name. He saw her face, a pale, terrified blur above him. He tried to speak, to tell her to run, to save herself, but the words would not come. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the wiry tracker stepping out from behind the rocks, taking careful aim. Then came the sharp crack of a pistol, not a rifle, and the tracker stumbled back, grabbing his arm, his face a mask of surprise. Clara. She had his revolver. The darkness swallowed him whole. He drifted in and out of a feverish, nightmarish haze. He was in a cave, the air damp and cold, a small fire pushing back the shadows. He was burning up, a fire consuming him from the inside out. Yet he shivered with a bone-deep chill. Pain was a constant, throbbing presence in his shoulder and head. Sometimes, in moments of lucidity, he would see her face, Clara. She was always there, her expression a mixture of terror and fierce determination. She would press a cool, damp cloth to his forehead, her touch gentle. She would lift his head and force him to drink water from a canteen, the cool liquid a blessing on his parched throat. He could hear her voice, a low, constant murmur. Sometimes she was whispering words of comfort, nonsense syllables meant to soothe. Other times, he heard her reading, the melodic rise and fall of the poetry from her book a strange, beautiful counterpoint to the agony in his body. He heard her cry, too, in the dead of night, when she thought he was asleep, soft, heartbroken sounds that tore at what was left of his conscious mind. In the depths of his delirium, the past and present bled together. The cave became another place, a burned-out homestead smelling of smoke and death. Clara's face became another face, one with the same dark hair, the same wide, frightened eyes. "Lily?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "Lily, I am sorry, I was not fast enough." He was a boy again, small and helpless, watching the flames consume everything he had ever loved. He had tried to get to his younger sister, trapped in her room, but the heat and smoke had driven him back. Her screams had followed him for the rest of his life. Clara knelt beside him, wiping his brow. "Hush, Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "It is me. It is Clara." But he could not see her. He was lost in the fever dream, confessing the sins that had haunted his every waking moment. "I could not save her," he mumbled, his eyes wild and unfocused. "And then the other one, Sarah. I failed her too. I always fail." He looked at Clara then, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was twisted, warped by the fever. He saw her not just as the woman who had crept into his heart, but as something else, something dangerous. "You," he whispered, his voice filled with a strange mixture of awe and fear. "You are my redemption, or my damnation. I cannot tell which." He was a man drowning in guilt, and she was either the hand pulling him to shore, or the weight dragging him down to the depths. Clara's heart broke as she listened to his rambling, fever-soaked confession. She finally understood the source of his ghosts, the true depth of the wounds he carried. He was a man who believed he was cursed to fail those he cared for, a man who saw his own love as a form of destruction. She leaned down, her own tears falling onto his hot, dry skin, and gently kissed his forehead. The gesture was not one of passion, but of profound, absolute grace. "You saved me, Eli," she whispered, her voice fierce and certain, a vow to cut through the fog of his pain. "That is enough." He quieted after that, sinking into a deep, exhausted sleep. For 2 more days, she did not leave his side. She cleaned his wounds with boiled water and fresh moss. She hunted with the revolver, her hands shaking but her aim true enough to bring down a grouse, which she cooked into a thin, nourishing broth. She fed it to him a spoonful at a time, her patience infinite. She was no longer a victim, no longer a ward or a runaway. She was a warrior, fighting for the life of the only person who had ever shown her true kindness. He woke on the 3rd day, the fever broken. The first thing he saw was her, asleep in a sitting position against the cave wall, his revolver in her lap. Her face was smudged with dirt and etched with exhaustion, but to him, she had never been more beautiful. The pain in his shoulder was a dull, manageable ache, and his head was clear. He remembered everything: the ambush, the pain, and the things he had said in his delirium. He remembered her kiss and the words she had spoken, the absolution she had offered. As he slowly recovered his strength over the next week, a new quiet settled between them. The balance of their relationship had shifted, fundamentally and forever. She had saved his life. She had faced down his ghosts and had not flinched. He was no longer just her protector. She was his. They were equals, bound by blood and fire and a shared, desperate will to survive. One evening, as he sat watching her sharpen the skinning knife on a whetstone, he knew that running was no longer an option. Cain had been right. They could not hide forever. The preacher would not stop until he had her back, or until they were both dead. To run was to condemn themselves to a life of looking over their shoulders, a life of fear. It was not a life at all. "We are going back," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She looked up, her hands stilling. She did not look surprised. She simply nodded, her eyes clear and steady. "I know." "We cannot win this by running," he continued. "We have to face him. We have to end it." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I will not leave you behind again. Clara, not to fight this alone, and not ever." A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the promise she had been waiting to hear her entire life. The next morning, they began their preparations. It was Clara who acted first. She took the skinning knife, and with a few quick, decisive motions, she sawed off her long, dark hair, letting the tresses fall to the cave floor. When she was done, it was short, ragged, and practical, framing a face that was no longer that of a girl, but of a woman who had been to hell and back and was not afraid to go there again. Eli watched her, his throat tight with a fierce, protective pride. When she was finished, he stood up, went to his saddlebags, and pulled out his spare revolver, a Colt Navy that was smaller and lighter than his own. He walked over to her and held it out. "But first, if we are going to do this," he said, his voice rough, "we are going to do it together." She took the gun, its weight solid and real in her hand. For the rest of the day, he taught her how to use it. He taught her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. He taught her how to load and clean it, and as she stood there, firing at a pine cone he had set on a rock, her short hair blowing in the mountain breeze, her expression one of intense, unwavering concentration, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that the Reverend Thaddeus Cain had made a terrible, fatal mistake. He had not created a victim. He had created a survivor, and she was coming for him. They rode back into Dust Creek not as fugitives, but as arbiters of a long overdue justice. They did not sneak in under the cover of darkness. They came at high noon, the sun directly overhead, casting short, sharp shadows on the muddy street. Eli rode bolder, his left arm in a sling beneath his jacket, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes as hard as iron. Beside him, on the other horse, rode Clara. her short-cropped hair ruffled in the breeze, and the Colt Navy Eli had given her was holstered on her hip. A stark and startling declaration. She was not the same person who had fled this town in a blizzard. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. She sat tall in the saddle, her gaze sweeping over the town and its inhabitants with a defiant clarity. They were not here to hide. They were here to finish it. Their arrival brought the town to a standstill. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. The doors of the saloon swung open, men spilling out onto the porch, their drinks forgotten. Faces appeared in windows. Curtains were pulled back. The whispers started immediately. A low hum of shock and speculation. But this time, Clara did not flinch. She did not look away. She met every stare, her expression unyielding. They dismounted in the middle of the street, directly in front of the general store. A deliberate and public act. They stood there, side by side, waiting. They did not have to wait long. He came from the direction of the livery, as if on cue. The Reverend Thaddeus Kane, his face a mask of pious indignation, his black coat immaculate. He was flanked by the two men from the mountains, the big, brutish one Eli now knew as Silas, and the wiry tracker, Jed, whose arm was in a sling, a mirror to Eli's own injury. "There she is!" Kane's voice boomed across the street, a performer taking his stage. "The poor, lost child, led astray by this violent sinner. I have come to reclaim my ward, to bring her back into the fold of decency and God's grace." A crowd had begun to gather, the townsfolk forming a hesitant semicircle around them. They were an audience, hungry for the drama, their loyalties uncertain. Kane took a step forward, his hand outstretched as if in a benevolent gesture. "Come, Clara, my child, your ordeal is over. I forgive you for your wandering. Come back with me." Eli's hand moved to rest on the butt of his gun, but Clara laid a hand on his arm, a small, firm gesture. "No," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "This is mine to do." She took a step forward, away from the shelter of Eli's presence, and stood alone in the dusty street. She looked not at Kane, but at the faces in the crowd, at Mrs. Henderson, whose sour expression was one of rapt attention, at the blacksmith, his thick arms crossed over his leather apron, at the saloon girls who watched from the balcony. She drew a deep breath, and, for the first time in her life, she spoke her truth to the world. "My name is Clara May Sims," she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she could have hoped, carrying in the sudden silence. "That man is not my savior. He is my keeper. He did not take me in as a ward. He took me from an orphanage as a servant, a possession. For years, I was his prisoner, hidden away behind his righteous words and sermons." A murmur went through the crowd. Kane's face tightened, his benevolent mask beginning to slip. "He calls this man a sinner," Clara continued, gesturing to Eli. "This man found me in a tent on the edge of your town, bruised and bound, because I had dared to defy my keeper. This man asked for nothing, but he gave me shelter. He gave me safety. He treated me not as property, but as a person." She finally turned her gaze on the preacher, and the force of it, the pure, unadulterated loathing, made him take an involuntary step back. "You speak of God's grace, but you know nothing of it," she said, her voice ringing with a power she never knew she possessed. "You use the Bible to justify your cruelty, to hide the wickedness in your own heart. You are not a man of God. You are a monster who wears the costume of a saint, and I will not be your victim any longer." The silence that followed was absolute. The townspeople stared, caught between the preacher's established authority and the undeniable, raw truth in Clara's voice. They looked at her short hair, the gun on her hip, the unwavering strength in her eyes, and then they looked at the preacher, and for the first time, they saw the flicker of panicked rage behind his pious facade. He was losing. The story he had so carefully controlled was unraveling before his very eyes. "Lies!" Cain shrieked, his voice cracking, his composure shattering completely. "The devil has twisted her tongue. She is a harlot, a sinner, and she will burn for her blasphemy." In his desperation, he made his final, fatal mistake. His hand clawed for the revolver tucked into his belt. It was the only proof the town needed, but Eli was already moving. He had seen the shift in Cain's eyes, the moment his rage overcame his reason. Even with his injured arm, he was faster. His Colt peacemaker seemed to leap into his hand. The street exploded in a deafening cacophony of gunfire. Eli's first shot struck Cain square in the chest, throwing him backward into the dust, his eyes wide with a final, unholy surprise. At the same moment, the big man, Silas, drew his own weapon. A shot from Clara's Colt Navy spun him around, a look of disbelief on his face, before a second shot from Eli's gun put him down for good. The tracker, Jed, was smarter. He was already diving for cover behind a water trough, his own gun barking. A bullet tore through the muscle of Eli's right thigh, and his leg buckled beneath him. He went down, gritting his teeth against the fresh wave of pain. He saw Jed rising from behind the trough, taking aim, but Clara had moved, her fear replaced by a cold, deadly focus. She fired twice. Jed jerked, dropped his pistol, and collapsed, his good hand clutching at his chest. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The street was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and a ringing silence, broken only by the whimpering of a frightened horse. 3 men lay dead or dying in the dust, and Eli was down. Clara ran to him, her gun forgotten, falling to her knees at his side. The front of her dress was instantly soaked with the blood pouring from his leg. She pressed her hands to the wound, her movements frantic, her face a mask of anguish. "Eli!" she sobbed, the sound torn from the very depths of her soul. "Oh, God! Eli, no!" He looked up at her, his face pale, a pained but gentle smile touching his lips. He reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that was mixed with the blood on her skin. He whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Still planning to ride away tomorrow?" She choked on a sob, leaning down and pressing her forehead to his, the blood and dust and tears mingling between them. "Not without you," she whispered back, the words a sacred, unbreakable vow. Time passed, as it does, healing some wounds and turning others into scars. Eli Warren did not die in the dusty street of Dust Creek. Clara, with the help of the town's doctor, got him to a room above the general store and nursed him back to health with a devotion that silenced the last of the town's gossips. The shootout had been a brutal, bloody baptism for the town. Faced with the undeniable truth of Clara's words and the preacher's final, violent act, something in Dust Creek shifted. The story of the girl who spoke out, of the quiet man who stood with her, became a local legend. The whispers about Clara died, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect, Mrs. Henderson, in a shocking display of goodwill, brought a hot meat pie to the room where Eli was recovering. She did not say a word, but her silent offering was an apology, an acknowledgement, a treaty of peace. The town was slowly changing, finding its conscience in the aftermath of the violence. When Eli was strong enough to ride, they left Dust Creek, but this time they left as friends. They returned to the mountain cabin, their sanctuary. It was scarred and neglected, but it was theirs, together. They rebuilt it. They replaced the door that had been kicked in by the bounty hunter, patched the roof, and scrubbed the floors clean of old memories. Eli, with his arm and leg now healed, built a proper porch, and Clara planted wildflowers in the soil by the front step, Indian paintbrush, bluebells, and columbine. The bright splashes of color were a defiant proclamation of life and beauty in a place that had known so much hardship. Clara smiled more often now. It was not the rare, tentative smile of before, but a deep, easy joy that reached her eyes and transformed her face. She read her book of poetry aloud to him in the evenings, her voice confident and clear. She learned the names of the birds that nested in the pines and the constellations that wheeled across the vast, dark sky. The ghosts of her past were not gone, but they were quiet now, their power diminished by the simple, steady presence of a love she had never thought possible. One morning, late in the summer, Clara came out onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee to find Eli in the yard, saddling Boulder. Her heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. The horse was packed with a bedroll and saddlebags, ready for a long journey. The old fear, the fear of being abandoned, returned with a surprising, sickening force. She stopped, the coffee mugs trembling in her hands, and watched him, her throat too tight to speak. He was a drifter, after all. Perhaps a man like him could never truly be tamed, could never truly stay in one place. He finished tightening the cinch and gave Boulder a fond pat on the neck. Then he turned and saw her standing on the porch, her face pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted look he thought he had banished forever. He saw the fear in her, and he understood. Without a word, he took Boulder's reins, walked the few steps to the porch, and tied the horse securely to the post. He then walked up the steps and stood before her, taking one of the coffee mugs from her trembling hands. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "If I ever ride again," he said, his voice low and steady, a promise that settled every fear in her heart. "You are coming with me." A laugh, thick with tears, broke from her lips. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming. It felt like sunshine breaking through a storm cloud. She set her own mug down and threw her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his chest. He held her tight, his one good arm a circle of absolute security. He tilted her chin up and kissed her, a long, slow kiss under the vast blue sky, a kiss that tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the promise of 1,000 tomorrows, all of them shared. Behind them, through the open door of the cabin, the embers of the morning fire glowed, a small, steady heart of warmth in the heart of the wilderness. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.